Dr. Jagyu could not be here, and so I was delighted that he has asked Honorable Gail Teixeira to be the keynote speaker in his stead. And so my pleasure now is to invite a member of the planning committee, Dr. Indiana, I like to call her Dr. Indiana, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again. Interestingly, her political career began at the age of 19 in Toronto, and she continued this career when she returned to Guyana in 1977. She served in numerous positions. She has been consistently elected to leadership positions in the People's Progressive Party since 1980. She was elected to Parliament in 1992 after the first free and fair elections in 28 years, and has since been re-elected in subsequent elections. The Honorable Gail Teixeira was appointed the government chief whip in the 10th Parliament, that's 2012 to 2015, and the chief whip of the parliamentary opposition currently. She has held 3 ministerial portfolios between 1992 and 2000 and has been a cabinet member through 5 successive governments from 1992 to 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a decorated career, that is serving and dedicated senior public servant. And alongside all that, she is a mother. So join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, the Honorable Gail Teixeira.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. I know I was getting worried that you would be terribly hungry and you might not want to listen, but I know now that you've had something to eat and you may be feeling a little more revived. Well, thank you very much for attending this session, the keynote address at the luncheon. As a sole member of the parliamentary opposition listened to speak in this first Diaspora Engagement Conference, I am quite awed by the burden and responsibility I bear in bringing our views to this gathering. More especially as I have been given 20 minutes to do so, and therefore I shall not be able to develop some of my arguments in such a short period of time. However, I look forward to the discussion period of luncheon and hope there'll be an opportunity for greater elaboration and dialogue. As a Guyanese and as a Guyanese woman whose family immigrated after the violence of the 1960s and after independence, and who returned alone at the age of 24, I have had some exposure to living in the diaspora for 10 years, as well as the challenges experienced in returning to my homeland. Although, when I did return, that was 40 years ago, so some of my experiences may not be relevant to the more recent returnees or those who wish to return. But I therefore have some knowledge and appreciation of both sides of the issue, the emigrant and the remigrant. I also speak to you today as a partisan partner, as I've had several ministerial positions, as well as I've been the presidential advisor in the government, and I have been a PPP's C parliamentarian for the past 25 years. And so I come to you as a partisan speaker. We all love our country, and for those who have made their homes in other countries and adopted new homelands, there is no place like home. At the same time, Guyanese have worked hard and bettered themselves and their families and contributed to their new homelands in many significant ways, as scientists, doctors, businessmen and businesswomen, teachers, nurses, and technicians in all fields. Many ran for political office and succeeded, and the number of MPs in the British Parliament, even Baroness Amos is also a Guyanese, a House of Lords peer in the British Parliament. And so we have a proud record of Guyanese also being involved in political office overseas. In Canada, there have been a number of Guyanese. One who was one of the longest serving MPs was from a mining town called Sudbury, who was elected over and over again in the Canadian Parliament. And so we come from a strong tradition of social service to our people, whether we're in our land or in another man's land. And this is continued in the second and third generations of Guyanese living overseas. However, I suspect the reason that some of you are here at this conference is to demonstrate your interest and the skills that you as a diaspora can offer our nation, as well as become more familiar with the present government's position and to decide on what opportunities are available to you at this time. If one were to ask me, and in fact any leader of the People's Progressive Party's civic cabinet during our administrations, what were some of the biggest challenges and what were the ones that would have taken time to overcome, I would have said, and still do, that the first was to restore democracy and build a democratic architecture. The second was to reconstruct a collapsed economy and physical infrastructure. And the third was the limited human and skills resources, which slowed down the speed at which we needed and wanted to go. These three challenges were not fictions, but real and demanding. None of them would take a short time to overcome. And I just use this as an illustration. The stock of government debt in October 1992 stood at 900%, which we reduced successfully to 50%. 153% of the revenue was used to service debt, and this was reduced to 4% of revenue by 2015. One of the most innovative initiatives by the PPP's administration, led by President Gail, was the Low Carbon Development Strategy and the trading of our forest carbons on the world market. We initiated the largest pioneer carbon trading scheme in the world for forest carbons, which earned us as a nation $250 million in revenue over a 5-year period, and contributed in no insignificant way to the development of our country. One has to ask what has happened to the Low Carbon Development Strategy. We have heard that that is no longer relevant and is being replaced with a Green Growth Strategy, but this also appears to be in limbo. We hear about very broad and general comments from officials, and we await seeing the draft or the final document at some point. However, we need to ask how much has Guyana earned in revenue over the last 2.5 years from the initiatives of the Low Carbon Development Strategy, the RED Plus, and the Guyana-Norwegian Partnership MOU. The issue of the diaspora and their potential and real contribution to Guyana's growth is nothing new. A study I did in 2008, based on the International Organization on Migration figures, which were from 1960s to 2005. The number of persons emigrating from Guyana legally between 1980 to 2004 was approximately somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 in the United States, if you try to give an estimate of the illegals, and in Canada, approximately in 2004 was almost 80,000. In fact, the census of 1980 showed that the population of Guyana had declined by over 80,000, attributed to emigration, high death rates for infants, mothers, and short life expectancy. In 1992, the life expectancy of Guyanese was 61 years. I'm now a little bit over that. My study showed that there was a direct and delayed correlation between emigration and violence and economic deprivation or poverty. An example of this in the study I did is that figures dropped by 1994 and then went back up after each post-election violence of the 1997 and 2001, and then again began to spike in 2002 to 2006 with the crime wave that we suffered from in this country. Presently, there is a spike of thousands of people leaving Guyana. One contributing factor is the ease with which US visas are being handled since 2012 to the present date. In fact, the US ambassador has himself admitted in February last year that the number of applications went up alarmingly from what was approximately 12,000 per year to 60,000. And in fact, at one time, they closed the embassy, the visa section, for 2 weeks to catch up with the backlog. We lost in the first 20 years of the post-independence era the largest outflow of Guyanese, approximately 250 legal immigrants. The enormity of this number in comparison with a population of 700,000 was and is numerically impossible to replace over the 30 years, unless every Guyanese living here produces approximately 10 children each, and we are able to bring back or attract over 70,000 people. Both feats, FAT, is impossible to do. As you know, Guyanese families have got smaller from the days in the 1960s and 70s where people had anywhere between 5 and 11 children. The average family in Guyana has 3 children, maximum. And even if one included the number of deportees to Guyana, on average approximately 200 per annum, for the last 30 years, these numbers, these persons returning as deportees, could not make up for the dent in this human and statistical loss. The loss was not, as some say, only a brain drain. We lost humans, bodies, physical presence. We lost contributors to the development of our country as taxpayers, as contributors to the NIS and income tax, for example. We lost persons with qualifications and those with skills, knowledge, and experience, but not necessarily only or largely persons with university degrees. There is a study that has been done by a senior officer at the Central Bank of Guyana, Ms. Deborah Roberts, senior economist, and her paper is entitled "The Development Impact of Remittances on Caribbean Economies, the Case of Guyana," and it was published before the pre-2012 census was done in Guyana. And she gives it's an empirical study, so it doesn't have any stuff that people feel are comfortable politically. But it is very important in terms of the data that it is able to share. For example, in her study, she was able to show that the largest and leading recipients of remittances in Guyana are women, receiving an average of 70% of the funds that come into Guyana as remittances. Regarding the education of the recipients, 54% of the recipients have a secondary education, while 33% completed university. 8% completed primary school, and a paltry 5% never attended school. Approximately 80% of the remittances recipients are less than 45 years old. 35% of the group are between 26 and 30, while 25% are between the ages of 35 and 45, and only 20% is under the age of 25. The majority of the recipients are children from their parents or relatives abroad. And of course, parents who are supporting children left in Guyana is a very common practice. 16% of the recipients are children receiving money from their parents, while 10% of the funds are sent to wives left in Guyana, and 12% is sent to husbands whose wives now reside in another country. So again, the men, you get a better deal than we do as women. You get you get 12% of the remittances, and the wives who are left back here with the children get 10%. Huh? So there's always this inequality, Vice Chancellor, no matter which way you cut it. It's a very good paper, and I discovered it on the net, and I was very proud it was done by a woman and Guyanese, and therefore it wasn't one of these consultant papers by the IDB and World Bank, but it was homegrown and done here. And so I encourage you, if you can find that, to look it up. I think it's a serious document that was done. In other words, what she's talking about is that the recipients of the remittances, it's a major contribution to the life of Guyana, to the nation, and to the economy. And the loss of the immigrants, whilst being the physical loss of people, is a critical issue. And as I said, and I repeat, the view that when you take a child and train them in nursery, primary, secondary education, and they leave Guyana, and worse yet, they leave after a degree, you're talking about a lifespan of almost one generation that you have to recoup. And so every person we lose to another country, it is creating a huge gap, each single one, in terms of our ability as a nation to recoup to train the next batch that will be able to take the place of those who've left. And certainly this has been a major challenge to Guyana. As I said, the contribution of Guyanese in the diaspora, like those from other developing countries, follow a similar pattern. And of course, I pointed out who are the different categories of people who are the recipients and beneficiaries. And the majority of these are from poor and low-income houses or households. But in terms of the numbers, and someone may have shared this already in the conference, I was trying to see where it might have come up. By 2000, the remittances to Guyana, according to the same study by Deborah Roberts, amounted to US $29.2 million. And by 2006, this had increased to $225.9 million US dollars. So this is not an insignificant amount of money. The remittances to the Caribbean, for example, in comparison, is pegged at US $6.4 billion, of which Guyana by 2006 was a percentage at $225.9 billion. Clearly, remittances play a significant role in revenue earning of the country and contributes to an increased purchasing power at the individual, family, and community levels. Remittances contributed to 11.2% of Guyana's gross domestic product in 2016, a decline from 14% in 2015. This was a result mainly because net current transfers decreased by 23.1% or $95 million US dollars over 2016, reflecting a drastic reduction of workers' remittances from abroad into Guyana. And in fact, there is a pattern, and I was reading in The Economist, that a place like Bangladesh and Pakistan that have enormous remittances that their economy actually is dependent on have seen drastic falls in the remittances being sent home, which may be a reflection of other factors and not that they've suddenly culturally divorced themselves from their homeland, but there may be physical and other impediments, which I'll try to come to in a minute. It should be noted that Guyana is just a drop in the global remittance trade, which in 2016 was pegged at US $441,000 million. Guyana received in 2016 only 320 million US of that amount. The largest destination for remittances from the US is Mexico, which the Pew Research estimates was equal to 24 billion US dollars in 2015. And so you can see too, with the issue of FATCA, which I assume you know about, the FATCA, which is the agreement by a number of countries where people are sending remittances as well as foreigners are working in your country, or in our case, dual citizens are benefiting from both, that the new FATCA agreement is going to put some major taxation concerns on persons who would be working here or living in both countries and benefiting in a number of ways from living in both countries. So the FATCA agreement and the anti-money laundering laws that we had to pass, and the updated one in 2014, which was only amended and passed in 2015, puts extreme difficulties on Guyanese sending remittances or remittances from any other part of the world. And in fact, the fee that has to be paid for remittances has gone up as part of the anti-money laundering exercises that the banks globally are taking to do the administrative and other checks to make sure that money isn't being sent that is laundered. So these are structural issues that will impact on Guyanese overseas sending remittances or other forms of support to Guyana. In the first BBPC government, we devised a remigrant policy to attract Guyanese with skills, as we were looking for short and medium-term ways of putting the stopgap in to do with the skills void that we had. And of course, the remigrant policy was to try to get skills or capital, and also to facilitate the return in investment in the country. This included concessions in taxes to bring home a container of household and personal effects, duty-free, as well as if they brought home their tools of trade, which included agricultural equipment, medical doctors, dentists, etc. In the first three BBPC governments, 1992 to 2001, approximately 4,000 persons remigrated home, And in addition to that, there was a very large number, and the largest number of persons who came into Guyana were actually coming in from Venezuela, who were returning to Guyana in the early 90s. As the majority of them were illegal, their children were illegal, and they wanted to come home and resettled. And so a lot of the facilitation to bring that group home, many of the children had no birth certificates, no records, to bring them home and have them settle back in their communities. The 4,000 that came back returned home, and a number of them had abandoned land and houses long years before, and they came back to reestablish themselves in their old communities. You also had the new migrants returning, those who came with their money and their resources. And so you had the combination of the majority of the 4,000 that came in were a combination of professionals, businessmen, retirees who had experience in management and business and so on. And so a lot of the persons who were involved with farming or wanted to get into aqua-processing and or aquaculture in later years, that these were some of the innovators who came in to Guyana. The professionals were mainly in the medicine, law, and engineering areas, and they opened their practices and contributed to improved services. As I said, many were also retirees who preferred the warmer climate whilst they kept the doors open, so they could continue to benefit from their long years of hard work and sacrifice in those countries with their pensions and other benefits. But they brought back their experiences of living in a much more modern and efficient country in how services and business was conducted. We also found medical professionals who were well established overseas, who could not give up their practices in return, but were prepared to come here and hold clinics and do sophisticated surgeries for specific times of each year. They saved us, our country, millions of dollars of foreign currency, as these interventions at that time could only be done overseas. The particular contribution of those in health have continued over the 20 years and more. It must be noted too that not all of these professionals were Guyanese, but Guyanese overseas used their network and with the government linked up with these specialists, universities and hospitals, and were to establish protocols and arrangements so that you could benefit from highly skilled specialists. This innovation allowed thousands of Guyanese to access services unavailable in the country, thus saving thousands of lives and leading to an improvement in the quality of their own lives. The role and contributions of what is now called hometown associations, I learned that phrase recently, because we used to call them Guyanese non-governmental organizations, but hometown associations kind of sounds nicer, has never been quantified. We've never, as a country, quantified the contributions and the role of the hometown associations. I'm not aware of any study done. And I think that we need to recognize the role of the hometown associations. They have played an important role in the areas, in particularly of education and health, especially in times of natural disasters. And I'm talking here from my own experience as a Minister of Health during the cholera epidemic, which was 1993, but also 1992, beg pardon, and also the floods of 2005. What was important is the engagement with the hometown associations. In health in particular, we worked on protocols to guide these groups on the needs and requirements of the health sector. And in the main, it worked out to be a relatively good working relationship. Go Invest in the early years too, especially targeted and assisted and facilitated Guyanese returning to invest in business, whether small or medium. One of the important things we did was to make legislative changes to encourage investments in the 10 administrative regions and added on further concessions, recognizing that we had to attract our own diaspora as well as foreign investors. As the economy picked up in Guyana in the midst of the global economic and financial crisis, was one of 2 countries in the Latin American Caribbean area that showed positive growth. And in this period when the world was in some great difficulties, there was an interest, a spike in the interest, both by Guyanese in the diaspora and foreign companies to come home and invest. In fact, Guyana showed 8 consecutive years of positive growth, whilst many countries were experiencing a downturn. The downturn in many of the homelands, including United States, because in that period, studies were showing that 1 in every 7 Americans were below the poverty line. It is this downturn in many of the homelands that encouraged Guyanese in the diaspora to return and invest their savings in their country. It is in the global crisis of 2008-2010 that we see a spike in the returnees. As a result, we saw small and medium businesses, agriculture investments being created by the newly returned returnees. And they brought with them a much more modern outlook, experience and knowledge to our country, a much more efficient way in which to approach business, and their own expectations of a more efficient and effective government services and the manner in which we in government operated. And this could be seen in almost every administrative region of Guyana. Many of the investments that came in also included manufacturing, information-based technology and so on, which were the new areas. However, whilst these developments contributed to an expansion and diversification of the economic base and revenue generation, they did not fill the void in the skills needs of Guyana. Therefore, parallel with these developments, including efforts to attract and facilitate remigrants and foreign investments, the government in the previous 10 to 15 years, up to 2015, trained more Guyanese as graduates, postgraduate, and at the technical levels than at any other time in our country's history. And I'll just give you one example. The single largest group in a 10-year period who were trained were over 1,000 Guyanese graduates in medicine, agronomy, and engineering in Cuba under the government of Guyana Cuba Scholarship Program. No other country was as magnanimous in spirit as Cuba, and for this we shall be always grateful. Over 300 doctors were trained and returned to our country out of the 1,000. The rest were in other fields, including sport medicine, physical education, occupational health and safety, and so on. Scholarships were also offered thanks to bilateral agreements with China, India, and Mexico, which also had an impact on the skills resources we were trying to build over the years. These young Guyanese returned, and many were and are serving our country up to today. We created incentives and access to the National Housing Program and low-interest loans in the commercial sector to attract these young professionals and encourage them to stay. So in other words, we are running on 2 tracks, trying to attract Guyanese to return, trying to attract foreign investments, actually a triple track. And the third one was to keep those who we had trained and let them stay and contribute to our country. Unfortunately, many have lost their jobs when the new government came into office. Approximately over 2,000 in the public sector, of which 1,972 were Amerindian Community Service officers, while approximately 10,000 have lost jobs in the last 10 years with the closure of a number of businesses, sugar, forestry, hospitality and entertainment facilities, and telecommunications. In this group of a conservative 2,000 who lost their jobs in the public service, 30% are qualified persons with graduate and postgraduate degrees. I did a recent study, I did a study of 36 women who lost their jobs in the last 2 years, who had graduate and postgraduate degrees. The cost and loss to Guyana is over $1 million in what we have lost by removing those 36 women. The loss to their families can be quantified at an even higher rate. These skills are irreplaceable and will take another 5 to 10 years minimally to replace within our own human resources here. The high levels of additional employment will put greater pressure for outward migration, and demand for remittances, which we have seen is declining. However, the public sector has grown by another 2,000, many on contract. And for some of you, you may not be happy what I'm going to say, but I do believe my country is still a democratic country. and that we still have the right to express our views, even though we agree to disagree from time to time. But I must say that there's no transparency of selection of skills. It appears as if the environment is one that merit does not count. And we have heard about discrimination, both gender, ethnic, and political. The statistics appear to bear this out, and I'm sure that someone will do a study to show whether that is true or not. As a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and never forget, multi-linguistic nation, there are 9 different peoples who have 9 different languages in this country. That the issue of inclusionary democracy demands there's representation at all levels in order to reduce marginalization, alienation, and a rapid recourse to run out of Guyana, as happened in the past. In fact, the emerging statistics are beginning to point to a pattern of increased immigration, and at this time, those who are leaving are a number of technically and academic qualified people, a higher number than what are in the earlier migration trends. This will have to be studied more as it is very recent. The new migration policy has attributed concessions, and some have been additional, and some have been removed, and others have been qualified or moderated. Many of you attending the conference are living in the diaspora, and you live in societies that are tolerant of different views and competing ideas, especially in the media and in academia. You live in countries where there's parliamentary democracy and where there's a separation of powers between the executive, legislature, and judiciary, and a free and open press. We here in Guyana have had to struggle for long years to restore democracy, and to also take another long period and hard work to create a new constitutional and legislative architecture that would allow for greater parliamentary and inclusive democracy in what still is, a nascent and emerging democratic nation. Today we are seeing how fragile and young these structures are, and whether they can withstand the challenges to parliamentary democracy, the threat to judiciary, and the separation of powers. The signs and patterns of behavior there, we know this well. We've seen this over 40 years ago. However, do not end on a negative note. A new opportunity is evolving through the discovery of oil and gas and its production. Much hope has been placed in this sector by the government to be the panacea for our woes. We believe that this is misplaced, but that is for a different discussion and not today. However, as a country, Guyana needs to have the following basic features in order to move forward with or without oil and gas. And certainly for persons who are returning to Guyana as migrants or coming to invest in Guyana, these are certain features they will also want to have clearly identifiable and trusted in Guyana. And these are free and fair elections, separation of the powers between the executive, legislature, and judiciary, a free and open press, and strengthened institutions such as the judiciary and the legislature and the police in order for them to take care of rule of law. These features which I've identified will allow us to use these new resources for our nation's benefit in an open and democratic state. In closing, let me just say to those in the diaspora that your lives there are busy and hectic, and the sacrifices you make, whether it is to collect donations or to fetch them down to put them in containers or to send them, or those of you who send money home to your families, or those who are saving up to come and invest in Guyana, that we understand your own sacrifices you make in those countries. We know how hard life is there, and we also know that you put your hopes in your homeland. And we support you and encourage you to come home. However, unity is an issue that we have to really understand in a different way. You will never get in this room or any other place, even in a family, everyone agreeing to the same thing and holding the same head. What we do need is sometimes forum where we agree to disagree. But I believe the Vice Chancellor is trying to catch up on his program. So whilst the other session took over half of mine, we're now galloping to make sure that, because a number of questions you're asking are very important and obviously political in the main. And so I guess as one of the opposition, as the only opposition MP here, it's a good opportunity for us to talk, as probably you may only get the views from me, which you may or may not like. In relation to the first question, the question that the gentleman asked about the 90% departure of tertiary graduates in the year 2000 and 20% skilled labor force. It depends what figures you use and figures where they come from. The World Bank, one of the studies they've done on remittances and migration that came out sometime around 2008, is probably one of the more reliable data banks to do with the estimation of persons who've left the Caribbean, including Guyana. And whilst it is true that of 2000 we did lose a lot of tertiary, I don't agree with the figure of 90% from my own experience and what figures we have seen. However, as I said in my whole paper, that a person leaving Guyana who has got a PhD or a doctor or has a master's, a teacher, a qualified nurse or a registered nurse, these are irreplaceable in the short term. They can be replaced, but in the short term they can't be replaced. And so the year 2000, it is now 2017, there's obviously a crop of younger people coming up as we replenish our population, although not as fast as we'd like to. And so the question is asked that, are the remaining 10% able to run the country? Well, in 2000, if 90% of your graduates left, I don't think that 90% are left in 2013 or 14. It's taking a data of 17 years ago and trying to make it applicable in 2017. So I have difficulty answering that question from a statistical point of view, because the statistics of 20,000 cannot be applicable in 2017 and then extrapolated from that to find out, well, there's only 10% left. However, you are right in the general question you're asking, and that is that, do we have enough people to run the country? But it depends what perspective you're coming from. And so you've tempted me, sir. You've tempted me terribly. And that is that, let me give an example. You're running the Ministry of Finance and you have not one macroeconomist there. The two macroeconomists in the country, two of the four in the country, are not in the Ministry of Finance and not in the government, one of whom is Jack Deo and the other one is Irfan Ali. So that's an example when you ask the question. Sorry, you gave me the opportunity. You gave me the opportunity. I couldn't avoid it. I couldn't avoid it, sorry sir. But I just give you an example because you're right. If we're looking at the budget and we're looking at our financial performance, we're looking at creating statistics and examining them for projections for public sector improvement, investment policy, and your budget for 2018, 2019, 2020, you have to have not only accountants and persons who know finance basically, and managers and public managers and planners, you need macroeconomists. And one of the biggest gaps right now in the government is you don't have any macroeconomists in the Ministry of Finance. And I just give that as an example, and for me on this side of the house, I believe that explains a lot of the problems that are being encountered with the finances, the economy. Obviously, the issue of the departures of the tertiary, by the figures of those who were trained after 2000 to 2017, as doctors, as dentists, as agronomists and engineers, the majority of those persons are still in Guyana. They're still working, they're still here, they have invested in Guyana in terms of their careers, their families, and their properties. And so we haven't lost a large amount, but as I pointed out, there is an amount that's leaving now. There is an increase in immigration based on the figures given by the American Embassy, not by the BBB. The second issue to do with balance and fairness, and the question to do with, and you made a comment that I wasn't as combative as my comrade in the private sector, my friend in the private sector. Maybe the difference is the difference between a politician and a businessman. Politicians hope to win elections. Businessmen don't have to win elections. And I leave you to think about that. The other issue you're asking about corruption. it's a very important question that you've asked, and I think it needs to be addressed, and I hope that the same question will be given to whichever government ministers come to speak to you at the conference, so that you get all sides of the story. You may not like my side of the story. But let me put this to you. Guyana signed the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption in 2006. And we've been reviewed 4 times in the OAS system, and all the reports on Guyana, both Guyana submissions and the reports up to the year 2013 are there. Guyana is supposed to be reviewed this year by the OAS Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. I haven't heard anything, because when we used to prepare to send our report to the OAS and to go to be peer-reviewed, including in situ visits to Guyana with civil society, private sector, sat in a number of those meetings, the judiciary, audit office, etc. It was quite a process of peer review by the OAS into Guyana. One, having the systems to fight corruption, the legislative framework, the capacity to do it, and it was seen as a progress report. And so in the Caribbean countries, there are a number of countries, for example, who do very well at the Transparency International, such as Barbados, but are not a signature to the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. And so Guyana has been, and has been before that body. I used to be the Guyana expert, and so I'm talking with some knowledge of the process. There is a new representative, I believe it is the gentleman who heads the State's Asset Recovery Board, Mr. Hitman. However, so that's at an international level, we're accountable. The procurement laws and financial regulations we brought in the 2004 period were considered, and are still considered by the Caribbean, as some of the most forward-looking, forward-drafted legislation on procurement. And in fact, up to a couple of years ago, a number of countries in the CARICOM did not have any such piece of legislation like Guyana's Procurement Act. So I'm talking about structures and systems. In terms of, were there any corruption under the PVP? My answer to that is that humans, if you can find me a human that all the time, and I can count for myself, I know as a politician and I know as a minister that your nose has to be clean, your ears have to be clean, your fingernails have to be clean, and you got to stand and keep your head above water to make sure that you don't get tainted with things flying around. But I cannot swear that there are persons that were working in the PVP government that may or may not have been corrupt. However, I will say this, that where there have been cases, there were investigations and there were charges made. However, under the present system, I particularly have been keeping a record of what we call scandals. And these have been public knowledge, it is not hidden in any shelf anywhere. But they've documented 34 scandals in relation to procurement, in particular in Guyana. One of much being where the Procurement Act has been violated and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent, for example, on drugs with no recourse to the procurement rules to get approval. In fact, in one case that's before Parliament, and we are taking it to Parliament, the $605 million was not approved by the National Tender Board, yet it was awarded to a foreign company. So it's a process. My view, I would never say, show me United States, there's corruption there. In fact, I refer you to one of the Economist articles on what is going on in Europe and how the European companies and governments, a number of them are highlighted in the document to show how they are undermining the procurement rules and regulations to give companies special privileges. And so I would never say that there's no corruption, but I'd always say it's a process, a progress, and it takes political will, and it takes political strength, and it also takes a lot of, at the political level, by any government, by any president, to be able to remove those who are found to be corrupt. The third question to do with government building on the low carbon development strategy, I'm glad to hear Commodore Best say that. Regrettably, Commodore Best, that has never been said in Parliament. And so what has been said in Parliament is the low carbon development strategy is being replaced by the green economy. And so I don't doubt you as a person who has been involved in the environment sector, but this is not what is publicly said by the ministers and Prime Minister in the legislature, nor in what are press statements in relation to climate change and the green economy. So that we look forward to seeing the green economy strategy, and we ask people, the low carbon development strategy is still posted on different websites, that it is multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral, and it was about not just climate change and dealing in a rather, what you call, restricted area with the environment. The question that was asked, last question by Mr. Roberts, on the issue of values, good order, and whether political parties exemplify those policies in order to move forward this government. And again, this is a question I think that you as participants must ask all politicians, whether from the opposition government or anybody else. That's your right to do that. However, for me, personally, the most important values are to do with democracy and human rights values. So I don't come with values in a very academic way. I come at them in values. What are human rights? What are the rights of our people to choose who they want to vote for, to choose who they want to support, to be able to read what they want, to demonstrate and picket if they want, to vote how they want, etc., etc. So that, for me, the rights, the human rights of Guyana, and I speak because I am passionate about this, that I was on the Human Rights Task Force for the Constitutional Reform Commission, and I feel very, very strongly about the adherence to human rights in our country, even when sometimes it is very controversial, and in many times when it is also divisive. But I do believe that the values, you may be talking about values that may be different from mine, or maybe they're the same as mine, Mr. Roberts. But my issue of values are principally based on human rights and the democratic principles of being able to function in a society in which there are differences of views. Within the party with which I belong to, there is that opportunity for difference of views. However, the view of my party is that we are free within our party to express our views at the various forums. However, when a decision is made, we comply with the decision of the majority. Now, in the old Marxist-Leninist days, there was what called now I forgot what it's called. Marxist centralism. However, it is not that. It is a principle that if you're going to have very strong views within your party, you disagree, you make a decision, then all men on board and women on board. And so, within my party, there is that opportunity for differences of views. However, when we go out there, it is solidarity. We stand together, and we are able to take positions that we've agreed on. I can't speak for any other political party, and I would not dare. I think it would be wrong of me to say if any other political party has their own values. I may think they don't have the values, but that's not, I believe, for me to sit here today. I believe that political parties in any part of the world, but particularly here in Guyana, that we must have an overarching, absolutely loyal commitment to democracy and human rights. And I believe with those two things that we stand by our Constitution, stand by the fact that our people are diverse, that we're different, we have different religions, different ethnicities, we have different even sexual preferences, which is also another topic that's controversial here, that we can find the space to be able to express those views in a different way. And express those views in a way that we can agree to disagree and we can agree to move forward. And I think those for me, so I may not be answering, Mr. Roberts, your question in the way you would like it to be answered, because I think it is for me, yes, of course we want good values and good order. But if you asked everyone in this room what they thought a good value was and what a good order was, you may come up with quite a number of differences of views. So I'm sharing what mine are and the ones of my party. Obviously, we want our leadership in our country, elected and otherwise, whether it's at the local government level the regional democratic councils, in the parliament, to be people, men and women of integrity, and to recognize that they are elected by the people. Regrettably, in the legislature now, there are some serious developments that are extraordinarily disturbing in terms of how the legislature is run, and the issue of the opportunity to express yourselves, and what is the sacrosanct, one of the issues that if we follow the British Westminster system, that one of the most critical issues in any parliament is the recognition and time given for minority rights. And that is right now, under siege right now, in the Guyana Parliament. So, I've said a lot, and I thank you very much for being patient. I know some of you may not have agreed with me, but I look forward to dialogue. I've been around a bloody long time. I'm no longer young, or young as I'd like to be, or young as I think I am. But one of the critical issues of Guyana, and just to repeat in the last link, and that is that there must be forum, where we can argue. We can sometimes stamp your foot. You can sometimes disagree strongly and passionately. And there must also be forums where we can find ourselves over a cup of coffee, and if you like me, a cigarette, and you talk about how to resolve issues in a real, meaningful way. And that, by the way, as a politician, I'm telling you, is really, really hard work. It is not easy, it doesn't happen overnight, and it does require, as a politician, you gotta bite your tongue 100 times, you gotta bite your lip 100 times to try to make sure that the goal of finding agreement is maintained. And we've had experience in this, and it has worked. It has been hard work, and it can be done again. But if the enabling environment isn't there, it will not take place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the VC to come forward and ask the Member of Parliament to return. I know you've been here for a little while, but we're asking you to stay a little longer.
Let's give another round of applause for Honorable Gail Teixeira. Gail, I want to assure you that I deeply appreciate the recommendation to have a centennial to memorialize the work and workings of Dr. Chetty Jagan. We shall do it at the University of Guyana.
Thank you very much.
But let me share with you part of a conversation about 3 months ago, as a group of us who are contemplating what would be the work program of the University of Guyana Press. One of the things we decided that we recognize as a lacuna is serious works on the leaders of Guyana. And so we're going to have in the first year work program writings in relation to Forbes Burnham, writing in relation to Chetty Jagan, writings and works in relation to Walter Rodney and others. And so that is one of our commitments as an academic press. We shall be pursuing that. But let me finally take the opportunity to, on behalf of the conference, give you a little gift, and I hope you wear it in recognition of the value of your being here and of what we're trying to do. We're starting at the University of Guyana some merchandising, selling. We've got right now a shipment on the way from China of mugs. But we have the first line of polo shirts and t-shirts, and I want to present one of our new polos to you on behalf of the conference. I got the right size for Gail. And let me take this opportunity to say that I would really love to have none of these polo shirts taken back. Everyone needs to buy one. Give it to someone. We have polo shirts, we have t-shirts, we have hats. Pick a color, buy it. Let's take a picture of my giving this to Gail.
I have to thank the Vice Chancellor. He chose the right color, red. That's a PVP color.
It's a Guyanese color.
And thanks to the BC who's demonstrating that he's not only an academic but a businessman as well. And so you've all been invited to